you very much.
Thank you for this excellent introduction. In particular, the last two speeches, which show the difference between the ends and the means in politics, and I will look less at the means, which I know less than my two predecessors, and I will look more at the political aspects. So I'd like to actually sort of change the title of my presentation to imitate that of Miriam Benrad, who made a wonderful presentation yesterday. And I'll call mine the extension of the areas of law, and it would be the reverse side or the flip side. And it would try to answer the question of what would be the political response of states, in particular France and the United States. And when we have a look at this topic, we realize that it's a poorly frequented subject. We had a number of articles on cyber terrorism and giving rise to no deaths, so we could do the same kind of number game on articles on terrorism. 90% are interested in terrorism and only 10% in the fight against terrorism. And of those, 20% talk about the weapons of mass destruction. And if one doesn't look at what states do, are reduced to a single attack in the subway in Tokyo in 1995. So not only the fight against terrorism is a poorly studied topic, it's a question of effectiveness, as mentioned by the first presentation this afternoon. The question of said, and the questions of effectiveness are very often not asked, and the questions of numeric effectiveness on this and that countermeasure are not really asked, whereas we know, and I'm looking at it from the point of view of the law and in contemporary processes, the idea of doing cost-benefit studies to anticipate laws that are under study is almost a constitutional matter. But nonetheless, in the case of terrorism, we say that the more hard laws we put into place and the more measures we put, the more policemen we recruit and the more spies and the bigger the army, it's mechanically effective, but the question of its effectiveness is not really examined. And finally, the question of the motives behind all of these laws are not really examined either. Is it really to reinforce security that we have these anti-terrorist laws? Not so sure. Why not so sure? Because all of the anti-terrorist acts that have been adopted these last some decades are not necessarily dedicated to reinforce security. And in order to understand that, we have to look at how states reacted. And in democracy, it's almost always the same. Laws and a hardening of attitude. And we can say that it's a 100% kind of response. For example, there's the Patriot Act in 2001, renovated in 2005, 2006, 2011, 2014 and 15, and 2004. There was the Intelligence Reform Act that extended the powers of the state in terms of intelligence being an important part of anti-terrorist legislation, and it gave more powers to the authorities, in particular for judicial oversight. We could get into details, but we won't. A special court in the state that decides whether they will give police investigative powers or not, and all of this is completely secret. In France, finally, we imagine that Americans are harder, but in fact, criminal law in France goes much further than American criminal law. It started in the 80s, following on the Iranian attacks that took place then. 86, 87, 2006, 2012, after the attack, in 2014 and 15, acceleration of these French laws, every time extending the powers of the state, which more and more is running headlong into the problems of the liberties that are guaranteed by the Constitution. In Canada, we could quote Bill C-51, and as Aurélie Campion mentioned yesterday, there's no judicial oversight or parliamentary oversight in Canada over the security services. So this raises some problems. We're talking about 3 countries that have rather well-developed criminal law. Now, for example, in the States, it's a life sentence for murder, but even some of the laws in France, ordinary criminal laws, have been condemned by the Constitutional Court of Europe, and the French Constitutional Council that ensures that French laws respects the Constitution. Now, more and more powers are being granted to fight against terrorism, and we wonder what the purpose and the effectiveness of these laws are, whereas the parties themselves raise doubts themselves. For example, the FBI put out a report this year saying that no terrorism matter. The new powers granted since 2001 had no decisive effect on any of the attacks that had been prevented these last 15 years. In France, the Minister of the Interior, after having defended the new act that gives much more power to the security forces for 45 minutes, then says that the problem really isn't collecting information or intelligence, but rather to analyze it. So having more means of information or intelligence gathering without wondering what use it is going to be put to. Well, the minister himself recognized that this act is more or less useless, or at least it misses the point. So much for the general reaction in democracies as they face terrorism today. Now, we wonder then why states act the way they do. It was mentioned somewhat by the previous speaker that there's a demand for security by public opinion. So the legislator puts forward this better security by adopting harsher laws. But this simply dispenses the legislators from justifying their own motivation. And if we look at opinion surveys in the United States, for example, the requests for better security as measured by public opinion surveys with regard to acts reached a peak after the 11th of September, but 1 year later, September 2002, then, the level of demand for better security had fallen back to approximately the same level it had prior to the 11th of September, 9/11. So finally, there's a disconnect between the offer and demand for security, supply and demand, independently. So security is provided independently of the requests made by the populations. And legislators aren't answering, therefore, only to popular demand. And the conclusion of all of that is that they're not offering security, but rather a feeling of security, which raises fundamental problems that were mentioned here. Then more security we promise, more in the case of a problem, the response will be violent, and people are being deprived of fundamental liberties in an exchange of liberty for security. But if we have less security and no security, or no improvement in security, well, then obviously the political backlash will be quite severe. So there you have the result of what can be said about the motivations, the motives of legislators and, more generally speaking, of decision makers in our Western democracies with regard to terrorism issues. And to conclude my presentation, I'd like to insist on the political challenges raised by terrorism, and that's when I come back to what Myriam Benrad said yesterday. It's ignorance or disbelief with regard to the political challenge raised by terrorist players that are the basis of a number of problems, a large number of problems, and which means that all of the anti-terrorism fight is laid at the foot or on the backs of the security services and the police and the army, who in fact should be only the last links in the chains. It's fine and dandy to say, oh, they missed the point, they didn't get the bad guys. But they're bearing the full burden of the fight against terrorism, whereas the political answer is very marginal. We could talk about the general problems caused by only a repressive response to terrorism. There's a question of image and reputation there. Every half hour of time lost in American airports to security firms costs $5 billion a year. In France, the new law on security and intelligence is very intrusive in internet matters, and it affected businesses. They moved their servers out of the country, so there's a cost in terms of image, reputation, and an economic cost associated to continuous repression. The second problem is obviously the threat to pluralism, which is a fundamental element of our democracies. Differing opinions, which should not only be tolerated but encouraged in democracy, are often classified as terrorist. For example, in the United States, the legal definition of a terrorist activity says who will investigate and what powers they will have, and these powers considerably reduce the rights of defense of persons accused of terrorism, and that's a real problem, a real attack on the fundamental rights. So the last and perhaps most important problem of a repressive response to terrorism is that we don't ask ourselves the question of why it's relevant and popular. And finally, all we're doing is eliminating commitment without asking ourselves why people are sincerely involved in this. And this is related, more generally speaking, to a lack of wondering about the kind of policies that democracies, in particular in the Middle East, for example, the support brought to dictators with beards or without beards, preventing people with beards from arriving in power, because since we protect the unbearded, then the bearded become more and more popular in the population's eyes and more visible. And the second problem in the foreign policy, oh yes, the beard. Yeah, I get you. It depends on the length, you see. And the second issue, of course, that would deserve a full presentation itself is the conditional support to Israel, or unconditional, that is whose colony policy has raised a lot of problems for decades. And what is also mentioned is the fact that the powers consider the Middle East as a geopolitical battleground. Pierre-Alain mentioned that at the outset of our symposium. And the interest of populations is the variable that can be played upon. And this kind of foreign policy generates frustrations and grievances and political motivations for radical change. There are other problems I could talk about, but I've just been given the 1-minute warning, so I will conclude by saying that when we talk about the deep underlying motives for terrorism, one invokes oftentimes the poverty of the populations, but it's not in the poorest places that we have terrorism. It's true that the fundamental reasons for terrorism are not basically socioeconomically, although those are facilitating conditions, but they're insufficient in themselves. But it's rather political grievances. Those who want the caliphate want a radical change. It's a project to fight. It's an anti-hegemonic project, as they see it. And the challenge of terrorism is a challenge. And I'm back here to the point about internal terrorism. Is the challenge, for example, with regard to young people who want to go apart, is the challenge of creating a real, inclusive democracy, and to deny the political issue and the need to bring political answers and to take seriously the grievances put forward by the organizations that we mentioned throughout the day. Well, to deny this challenge is taking the risk that we will go through other tragedies like the one that seems to be unfolding today, 13 November in Paris.